Great. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Amber Brandhagen. I am the Chief Operating Officer and Principal of NEI Global Wireless, and I'll be moderating today's session. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box, and I will address them throughout the webinar. I'm also sharing our speakers' contact information in the Q&A should you wish to connect with them directly after the webinar. Without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers. Jeffrey Moerdler is the head of the real estate and communication practice at Mintz in New York. During the past 30 years, he has developed a unique specialty practice in the intersection of real estate with technology, communications, and energy issues. He has extensive experience representing landlords, tenants, and communication service providers in the leasing, purchase and sale, and financing of data centers. David Moore is the CEO and principal of NEI Global Wireless. David started his career in 1977, and his vast knowledge and experience includes development, brokerage services, property management, and asset management. NEI Global Wireless specializes in wireless landlord representation across the nation and has closed transactions in 35 states. All right, David, all yours.
Thank you, Amber, and thank you everybody for joining our webinar today. NEI Global Wireless is a full-service brokerage firm dedicated to landlord representation. Some of the services that we provide are new sell lease agreement, new builds, amendments, sell lease monetizations, where we list a sell site, sell lease for sale, and then bid it out. Site relocation for developments of properties or redevelopments, sell site management, opinions of value, and then just any other service that landlords require within the wireless spectrum. Our real estate expertise really comes to play many times because sell leases and brick and mortar real estate are very different when it comes to evaluations. And so we kind of bridge that gap with brokers, developers, and buyers across the country. So we want to get into kind of what the trends are we're seeing right now in telecom because it changes on a regular basis. The carriers are really adding generators to cell sites, especially tower companies across the country, anywhere that there is a challenge with the electric grid. So we've seen an uptick in generator installations in California, throughout the South, anywhere where they have weather events that really have a challenge on the electric grid. So we're seeing a lot of work for compound expansions, additions to amendments where generators need to be installed. The tower companies are still very robust at renewing lease agreements with 10 or less years remaining on term. They want to secure these sites for 20 plus years so that they can drive revenue as a vertical landlord. So we do a lot of amendment work with tower companies where there are 5 to 10 years remaining in term. Obviously, the pay point is going to be better, or the terms and conditions will be better if there are 5 years or less in the term, but we are still getting favorable terms and conditions with 10 years. Dish is still very robust, working around the country as the fourth carrier. They have a requirement to get 15,000 sites up and live here in July. They're not going to make it, but I think their story is going to be good enough for the FCC to give them kind of a pass because they're working diligently. We have a large book of new build Dish sites on rooftops or expansions of compounds on towers, but they have their master license agreements and have had them secure with tower companies for quite a while. So we do expect the deployments there faster than rooftops because it'll take less time. The tower companies and the carriers cannot ignore small cell development. It is something that they have to do to create a boost between the 5G macro sites and limitations that they have in signal boost. There's no money in small cells. The rents they pay are usually 100, 150 a year. There's no scalability. When you put a small cell in, you can't add anybody to it. So it's really kind of a pain, but it's necessary. And we're seeing them in many, many urban areas. No rural areas per se, but in urban areas where they need to get connectivity and continuity of service, we see a lot of small cells go in. The newest thing that's been happening, and it's really been happening for quite a while, but it's catching everybody's eyes, in-building Wi-Fi and distributed antenna systems. I'm going to let Jeff speak later about DAS systems, but as a real estate professional, it is imperative that you have a tenant experience. And in-building Wi-Fi and DAS are going to be the one way to gain and retain tenants, control that as a fourth utility. So it just makes sense. Right now, the cost of an in-building or DAS is so prohibitive unless you have a large Class A million square foot building large apartment complex where you've got hundreds, if not thousands of units, that's where you've got some economies of scale, but it's not going to be available to smaller public, the small projects, industrial parks are small. It really is something for concert venues, stadiums, and whatnot. And I'll let Jeff expand on that one.
Sure. Go ahead, David, you finish and I'll introduce that later.
Roll the next slide, would you, Amber?
It's up. Can you not see it?
Oh, there we go. Yes. The other thing that we should caution everybody is the landlords are constantly receiving disingenuous letters and calls from the tenants and the carriers, from the tenants and carriers, third-party consultants about decreasing the rent, or the possibility of that relocating. It's just a placebo to scare landlords. And so anytime that you receive these letters, you should pretty much ignore them and never get to a point where you actually retrade your lease negatively. They don't call and tell you when things are good and they want to pay you more rent. It's to their benefit to reduce their rent profile, because other than employees, rent is the second highest expense that the carriers have, fixed expense. So if they can reduce the rents across the board, with 50,000 cell sites, it's to their bottom line benefit. So really never buy into that. When a site gets decommissioned, you get the letter saying that we're terminating the lease. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. It's never preceded by a letter asking a rent retrade, or they'll do it. It either works for them or it doesn't. And when it comes to selling lease agreements, be cautious about the buyer, because the highest price is not necessarily the best buyer. There are certain practices that individual buyers, there's only a few sell lease buyers in the country that are really good at it. And in some cases, they have long drawn out systems in place, multi-department, maybe they're publicly traded or they're private companies. It really depends. So it's very important that when you're selling your lease agreement, that you match the buyer to the best price and the best buyer, because at the end of the day, you have to live with an easement agreement that is anywhere from 50 to 100 years or perpetuity. And it really makes a big difference when you're encumbering a piece of real estate with who your quote unquote partner is in the future. The other thing we're having a lot of struggle with on amendments and new builds is that landlords are wanting some form of consumer price index. The telecom industry has fixed increases annually or per term. They've compressed to 2 to 10% or 3 and 15% respectively. That's been kind of the industry norm for the last several years, even though inflation has been lower. We're now having a lot of landlord pushback, and I have a conference call later today because a landlord is wanting an open-ended CPI on a 30-year term, and obviously the carriers can't accommodate his needs. And it's a real struggle with landlords right now accepting a below inflationary index on a lease agreement. And my explanation to them, as yours should be as well, is the carrier or the tower company pays 100% of the expense of putting that asset in there. These are long-term lease agreements. The rent stream and the increases really don't affect a brick and mortar landlord like the 3 to 5 year leases they typically do with increases, and you've got adjustments in rent periodically. When it comes to telecom, it's normal to have these lower increases, and it's going to be very difficult unless this continues on for a long period of time to get carriers to pay more than 3%. The 4s and 5s, which we've seen in the past, really haven't been around for a long time. So that's another thing, that there's a real disconnect between landlords and the tenants as well. And so I want Jeff to kind of answer or look at this fourth bullet point, because this is about when you're installing infrastructure in building, not necessarily a tower, but I'd like him to take a look at this next thing and kind of expand on that a little bit.
So I'm in New York, and in New York in particular, I get a phone call probably once every 2 or 3 weeks from a client or another lawyer who I know who knows about my specialty in telecom infrastructure, saying, oh, somebody showed up at my client's building. It's either the local incumbent telephone provider or a cable company or a fiber company. And they told my building manager that I have to let them in and I have to sign this document giving them a right to access to install infrastructure, be it fiber coming into the building or copper or cable TV, and to let them do installations in the building. There are, I believe it's 4 states that require by law a property owner to give access to a provider. There are a few other states that have more limited laws, but as a general rule, you're not obligated to let them in. And you need to talk to somebody before you do, and that document they're going to hand to your super or building manager or to you saying you approve them coming into the building. If you read it carefully, it probably gives them a perpetual access right to come in and bring in more infrastructure into the building. So don't sign something without it being carefully reviewed, and take all of those things with a grain of salt, because 95% of the time, they don't have the rights that they're telling you, and you're not obligated to let them in or to sign anything. So just be cautious.
Thanks, Jeff. And then the last bullet point is a telecom audit. 90% of our clients have the poorest record keeping on the planet when it comes to their cell leases. They can't find them. They don't know when the amendments were done. Their dad did it, their grandfather did it, and it's a nightmare. And if they can't find their lease documents, they certainly haven't audited the lease. They get their checks, they really don't think too much of it. So we always encourage our clients to make sure that if they don't keep track of their lease agreement and make sure they understand everything and have their own abstract and audit, that they hire a third party, or at least have a third party provider come in and make sure that their lease is managed correctly, that they understand what their obligations for entry, rent increases, use clauses, all the different things that could potentially be a pay point in the future, because they just sign things, they agree to things. I'm working on a site in Maine where they allowed them a 20-year extension for $1,300 a year. So these are things that, be overly cautious. Going back to Jeff's point on that earlier bullet point, be overly cautious when approached by these third parties, because you need to understand what they're asking from you and how the contract relates to their ask.
I would just say consider also a part 2 of that. Part 1, David described as the audit of your documentation. The second part is a physical audit of what equipment is there and confirming it matches up to the lease and they haven't installed extra equipment without permission. And watch what happens when you give them access that they're not installing equipment. Be cautious.
Great point. Great point. So as a real estate professional, I think it's really imperative for you to understand that you've got any cell site on any property USA is the tail that wags the dog. And we are seeing more and more redevelopment opportunities and properties that are no longer functionally or economically useless, and they're just obsolete. And so it means taking down a structure and going from a faith-based property to a car dealership, a townhomes, apartments, whatever the case may be. And cell lease agreements encumber the real estate for 10, 20, 30 years sometimes. And you just can't ask the tenant to go away or terminate. You need to deal with that. And so it's important that you understand some of the economics of relocations, temporary or long-term relocations of cell sites when redeveloping a piece of property. And another thing to consider is as we go into this recessionary period, which I tend to think we've been in a recession, but nobody wants to admit it. But with the Fed keep doing rate hikes, and it's going to continue to be difficult. And so a cell lease agreement is a piggy bank on your property. And it's really a great thing that you can monetize and sell at any given time. Prices are still very robust for these assets. And you can do a 1031 tax-deferred exchange. You can pay capital gains. You can reposition your property. You can pay down debt on a blend and extend, because if you've got loans coming due, they're going to mark to market that loan. And if you've got to come up with a bunch of cash just to refinance your debt, that might be a way to do it. Generally lenders like that, freeing of capital. So you should consider those kind of things as we continue to have robust buyers in this market.
Just
and the
to
other thing is
clarify, sorry, David, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No,
I
go
was
ahead.
just going to clarify that there are two different ways you can sell a cell site lease. One of them is an outright assignment of the lease and either sale of the property or creating a ground lease or a sandwich lease, where you bring in an intermediary for all purposes. The other is something that's developed over the last 10 years or so, where there are a bunch of companies that will buy the income stream under a cell site lease. They aren't owning an interest in the real estate. They're basically saying you have 10 years left on a cell site lease with Verizon, and they have 3 5-year options. And I'll take the gamble as to whether they exercise those and whether they put additional equipment there. And I'll give you $250,000, $500,000 now, and I'll collect the income from them. I can let them add more antennas or expand their space, but I get all that income in return for giving you the lump sum cash now. The thing you have to be careful with those agreements is two sides of it. They are not taking over the operating responsibility of your building if they buy the income stream. They're only buying the cash flow. And you still have to provide access, maintain and repair the building, fix the roof, the parapet, whatever needs to be done, provide electricity to the cell site. So it's the income stream, not the whole asset that's being purchased. And often those rights are a permanent easement, or I'm doing a deal now where the offer to the client gave them 3 options. Sell the income stream for 25 years, 50 years, or 65 years. And there was, this deal contained something that the first draft of many don't, which is a sharing of additional revenue. So if they bring a second carrier into the roof, taking additional space, or the existing carrier adds more antennas, there was a sharing of that additional income stream. Usually the first draft doesn't contain it. So you have to just understand what you're giving up and make sure that the lump sum you're being offered is a realistic, reasonable, discounted present value for the income stream that you're giving up and the potential to add additional income.
Great points, great points. The other thing that it's kind of slowed down a little bit as we're kind of maturing the 5G deployment, but lease agreements that were established in the 90s, which there's a lot of them out there, they never took into consideration the changes in technology and the rapid changes in technology, especially 5G upgrades. So during the initial period of 5G rollout, we were able to amend lease agreements with our clients and get pretty decent pay points for the upgrade that occurred on 5G. And as a result, the carriers and the tower, well, the carriers, not the tower companies, but the carriers put in clauses that allowed for expanded use. And so they've kind of stopped a lot of landlords' ability for future revenue for upgrades. And they've kind of kept it in an omnibus expanded use clause. So we had a lot of pay points and amendments that landlords benefited for the 5G rollout. That's still possible, but again, it's important that you understand your lease agreement, what your rights are, and never approve something just because they say it's their right. You know, you need to consult with somebody that understands this business and is it a pay point or not. And then I'll let Jeff kind of roll into the in-building solutions for tenant retention.
Can I take a minute real quick? We do have a question.
Yeah.
All right, so one of the questions is, what, if any, concerns are there when the tenants are medical? HIPAA, question mark?
I've seen studies. Oh, go ahead, Jeff. You know this more than me, I think.
So there are two different sides to that. One is whether they're the engineering concerns and radiation risks. A lot of people raised those concerns 10, 20, 30 years ago. All the studies I've seen have been that the only radiation or environmental risk of a cell site is if you stand right in front of it. If you're in the building below the antenna or in the building across the street, the radiation emitted is not material. If you're on the roof where the cell site is and you walk right in front of the antenna, that's a bad thing. And those sites have to be controlled. There are OSHA requirements and local building code requirements about limiting access to where the cell site is located, and signage and striping on the ground and such. But other than that, I'm not aware of health risk. The HIPAA question is privacy of information, and as the owner of the real estate, you won't have access to any of the data that's transmitted through that cell site. So I don't see any HIPAA or data privacy type concerns.
And one of the things we always insert in lease agreements is that there's an obligation to comply with the electromagnetic field regulations established by the federal government. So that's one of the stop gaps we have in the lease, so that the tower companies or the carriers have to affirm in the lease agreement that contractual obligation. So that's, you know, they're pretty safe. I mean, we receive bombardment from all kinds of other negative things when we're exposed outside, but you know, like Jeff said, unless you're in front of the antennas, it's negligible at best. And then with that, I'll let you go ahead and take that last bullet point.
So let me first start at a basic level, talking about what in-building solutions mean. So when the cellular networks were originally designed and rolled out in the mid-1990s, most of the network traffic, the people using cell phones, were either in cars or walking on the streets. And the original antennas were all on low buildings pointed down at the street. Things have evolved over the last 25 years, 30 years, and much of the network traffic is no longer on the street and the sidewalk. It's inside the buildings. So my cell phone is sitting on my desk. I'm wearing my Apple Watch. I've got my laptop here, and they're all connected to the network. My old office building had, on a 3-story building next to, I was in the Chrysler East building, the building next to and connected to the Chrysler building. And on a 3-story building next to, across street from our building, they had a cell site, 2 cell sites in effect on the roof. One was pointed down at the street. Second was pointed up at the Chrysler building and my building, in order to get cell service into the building. But that's very inefficient. And the carriers and property owners have started to realize that, particularly if I'm on my cell phone in my office and I walk to the center of the floor, or heaven forbid, get into the elevator, there's now all that concrete and steel between me and the outside of the building. That cell site across the street has to push 2, 3, 4, 5 times as hard to allow me to maintain the cell phone signal for the call I'm on, and use up much more of the capacity of that cell site for my one call. Plus, my handset, my phone, has to use 2 or 3 times or 4 times as much battery. It'll get a little warmer, and it generates a minimally additional amount of radiation. So what developed was putting cellular inside the building, so the site across the street doesn't have to push into buildings. And what was developed was what's called neutral host, or in-building wireless, or distributed antenna, or DAS, D-A-S, distributed antenna systems. And what that is, for example, I represent Madison Square Garden for 20 years and do all their telecom infrastructure. And when I did their original cell site leases with all the carriers, and when they did the big renovation of the garden about 8 years ago, before that, we planned and built in a system. We terminated all the cellular carriers that were in the building, ripped out their infrastructure, put in one shared system. So each of the carriers has infrastructure in a room where there's what's in effect a combiner. It takes the signals from all the carriers, combines it into one set of signals, pushes it out over one set of antennas for the entire building with better coverage, less conflicts between the carriers, and a more unified system covering every inch of the garden. That's a DAS, or distributed antenna or neutral host. It's neutral in the sense that it supports all the carriers, doesn't favor any over the others. So that's the background to the installation of a DAS system. Carriers will contribute towards the cost of installing that system. For a large office building, typically over 1 million square feet, for a transportation hub, a shopping center, and a lot of sports and entertainment arenas like Madison Square Garden. Why? Because cell service is no longer an option. It's an amenity that is becoming a necessity inside buildings, and it's a necessity for a landlord to provide good service to their tenants. The rub comes in when you have a building that is an office building under 1 million square feet, or most residential buildings where the carriers are not going to pay all, and in many cases won't pay any of the cost of the CapEx to install that system. New buildings, many of them are building DAS, both office and residential, in as part of the construction of new buildings. In gut renovations, it's included. The problem is existing buildings that are not new construction and not doing a gut renovation. It's a big capital expense that usually the property owner has to pay. But if you want your building to be state of the art, it's kind of like where electricity was 150 years ago, when it was first being rolled out and people had to pay for it to get it in their buildings. When my law firm did our new lease a couple of years ago in our office in Boston, where we have about 250,000 square feet, we required the landlord as part of our lease to install a DAS in the building, so we knew we would have better cell service, because it used to be if you walked away from the window, you lost your cell coverage. And now with lots of people working off cellular on laptops, it was just an untenable situation. Tenants are regularly asking for these systems more and more often, particularly sophisticated tenants. The network can support the tenants' networks, and depending on the system, sometimes it also includes Wi-Fi. If you want a Wi-Fi system, it can be installed at the same time as a cellular DAS. As we move more to Internet of Things and more applications controlling equipment in the building, having that kind of a system allows all your light fixtures, your air conditioning and heating units, your elevator systems to be actively connected to the internet, monitored, connected to a unified building management or BMS system, has huge advantages in a building. I'm doing the DAS right now for the Sphere in Las Vegas that Madison Square Garden is constructing. Google it, watch one of the videos about it. It's amazing. It's basically a large ball, sort of like the Epcot ball. It'll seat between 17 and 20,000 people inside the ball. The whole inside of the ball is one big LED screen, and it's designed for interactive programs where the DAS allows each of the people in the audience to have their phone or their iPad or their laptop play multiplayer gaming, 1,000, 2,000 people playing one game that's broadcast on the inside of this sphere. The outside of the sphere is also a big advertising LED screen. So the DAS is critical for the operation of that kind of a facility. But it's no different in offices there or in residential buildings. There are three basic business models for a DAS system. One is the owner installed, owned, and operated system. The second, and financed, and the owner pays all the costs. The second is a third-party installed, financed, and operated system. Companies like American Tower, Crown Castle, and many others will pay that cost instead of the property owner paying it, and hopefully recover it from the carriers. And the third is a carrier installed and operated system. The second and third generally only exist for those larger office buildings, transportation hubs, shopping centers, and sports stadiums and arenas. You're really on the first option of the owner installing and paying for it on a smaller building or on a residential building. So a bunch of the issues that come up in these systems. If the owner installs it, they control it, they design it, they have access to the data on the system, they understand how many people are using it, who's using it. If a third party does it, generally the owner has some limited input, but it's really controlled by the third partier. Same if a carrier installs the system. And the party installing it designs and controls that system. It's a big project for an owner to design and install a system. Typically, they get a third-party consultant to assist them and deal with the design, the carrier agreements and such. But it is more work for an owner if you're doing the first model of an owner installed system. If you're outsourcing it to a third party or letting a carrier do the system, they take much of the burden off, but you need to coordinate with them and make sure that you're comfortable with what they're doing. The CapEx of an owner installed system is substantial. On a larger building, it can be offset by or completely covered by carrier reimbursements. On a third party or a carrier installed system, the CapEx really is covered by the third party, but they get the revenue from the system. If it's a residential building or a smaller office building, much harder to find a third party or a carrier that's willing to incur that expense. Typically, these systems on an operating basis are covered by the carriers. There may be some modest expenses the owner incurs, legal fees being one of them, and consultants fees. If a third party does it, it's really just your legal fees and engineering fees of negotiating the deal. And sometimes you can get the carriers or the third party to contribute to those. One issue is who's looking over the shoulder of the participants to make sure it's being done right. When the owner installs the system, the carrier is watching that the owner installed it properly so that they're satisfied in order to join the system and pay any reimbursement. When a third party is doing it, both the owner and the carrier are watching what they're doing. Little different situation when a carrier installs a system. to some degree, you could say you're hiring the wolf to guard the hen house. The carrier that wants to use the system is also installing it and then going out and trying to sign up other carriers to join the system that the first carrier installed. And they have kind of a conflict of interest because they want to recover more and provide more of the cost and provide lower service to their competitors who they're signing up to share a system. So there is a bit of a conflict of interest there that can be a problem. I always like to look at how big a headache any project is for a property owner. If you're installing an owner-installed system, it can be a big headache for the property owner because you have to make sure everything is done right. But the carrier can have a headache if you don't do things right. Similarly, if you have a third party install a system, if the carrier installs it, there's a risk for the owner that they might not have done it right. And you also have the risk of the other carriers joining the system, and will they join? But it becomes the risk of the first carrier that installed the system. What are some of the major risks to the parties? The owner in an owner-installed system has a risk of cost overruns, and what happens if you build it? Will they come? Will you get 2 or 3 carriers to sign up for your network? Depends on what you're seeking in the way of charges, reimbursement, CapEx, and operating expense from them. The third-party installer is driven by a profit motive. They want to pay as little as possible to install the system and get the maximum return they can get from the carriers that are joining the system. If a carrier installs it, the risk I described before of, is it really carrier neutral? And are they giving a different quality of service or overcharging the other carriers? Used to be a much worse problem. It's gotten better in the last 10 years because each of the carriers has learned from experience, if they're not fair to the other carriers, it's going to come back around to them on the building across the street that's being installed by the other carrier next month. The carriers have risks of whether the owner in an owner-installed system will deliver the project on time, on budget, with all the technical specifications they need met. But if you have a good consultant and a good owner and a good construction contractor and a good project manager, none of that should be a huge risk. When a third party installs a system, the carriers always watch that they're not being overcharged, because you're now adding another party into the carrier owner equation as a middleman that's driven by a profit motivation. If the carrier installs the system, they're going to be concerned that the owner will cooperate timely, let them do what they need to do, and let them maximize the revenue from this system. That's basically, in a nutshell, the story with distributed antenna systems. Love to answer any questions people have, either now over the Q&A, or feel free to email me or call me.
One thing that has popped up before, Jeff, and I'll kind of preemptively cut this off. Everybody is asking about if they hook up their equipment to an in-building system, is it secure? And the easy answer is it's as secure as your computer, your servers, and your own company's security on your own computer system, because you're basically just going onto a Wi-Fi system, no different than your phone is or your computer is or anything else. So there's no security issues or generally no security issues related to that. Am I correct?
So it doesn't add any new security issues. It's no different than when you walk using your cell phone on the street. Can that signal be captured and cracked by someone else? Very hard to do for cellular. This won't change anything in that equation, although the carriers and whoever's operating the DAS have to properly secure, password protect, and encrypt the data on those systems. If you're installing a Wi-Fi system, that creates a different level of security, because typically a Wi-Fi system, much of the time, is not password protected, encrypted, or secured. By pure coincidence, my law firm changed our policy last week. The Wi-Fi networks in all our offices used to be a guest network that was open to anyone joining. We changed it and we password protected it last week. So now if you want to use my law firm system, including me, I had to enable it and put the password in on my cell phone to use the Wi-Fi when I'm walking around my own office. That's great, and that should be done. And it's very helpful. It's another layer of security on a Wi-Fi system. You know, if you go in and you use a Wi-Fi in a Starbucks or in a hotel lobby, or when you're at a conference, you're at the mercy of that system, which may or may not be password protected. And even if it is password protected, somebody visits my law firm today, gets the password legitimately because they're here for a meeting. Now their cell phone is likely permanently connected, if they're in my building, to our Wi-Fi network. And you know, they could do something inappropriate in the future. So password protecting a Wi-Fi system is a great additional level of security, but by their nature, Wi-Fi systems are less secure. So I've shifted. When I travel and such, I no longer use the hotel Wi-Fi system or a restaurant Wi-Fi. I either use my cell phone as a hotspot and connect my laptop to that, or I rely for my cell phone coverage not on the Wi-Fi, but on the cellular network, or I use a VPN, virtual private network, that encrypts the data and creates a private tunnel to protect against hackers. But you have to be more conscious and more sensitive to these security issues every day.
And one thing I want to bring up, because we kind of glossed over it a little bit, but these in-building systems are imperative for future development because it's part of a tenant experience. We, as real estate developers over the decades, we change buildings for the times. You know, they have residential and whatnot, there's all these different amenities. And if you are in control or have the ability to have in-building Wi-Fi, you have a better tenant experience. And it's easier to retain tenants because they don't have to always be going around the building, as Jeff said, looking for signal. You know, stand next to the window, you know where you've got dead spots here and there. And it's a fourth utility. What developers, you know, because they're always looking at ways of generating new income. And if you are able to have your own system, that's a fourth utility. And you can monetize it. You can have the tenants pay an extra nickel a square foot, a dime, whatever the case may be, because it eliminates their ability to go out and get their own routers, their own Wi-Fi provider, and it becomes very seamless. And you have less junk in your building, less routers, less systems. You basically control it, but you can charge for it. And everything is Wi-Fi enabled. Watches, phones, tablets, computers, thermostats. You've got all of these building systems that are generally Wi-Fi enabled, all using signal. And there's, quite frankly, just not enough signal. Right. And the other thing, if nobody likes 5G, 24, we're going to roll out 6G. And because 5G is not obsolete, but we'll never see a complete rollout of 5G in America until 6G starts to be deployed. So we're going to continue to upgrade these systems because of all the different devices I had to replace a garage door opener at a home I have, and it's Wi-Fi enabled, so I can have my phone open my garage door. I don't have a clicker in my car. I just go on my phone and I hit the button and it opens the stupid garage door. It's the dumbest thing in the world, and why would I need something like that? But that's how lazy we become as a population. Is I have a Wi-Fi enabled garage door opener.
So the flip side of that is my car, which is 6 years old now, came with a system that I have an app on my phone, and I could remotely lock and unlock the doors, locate where my car is if I forget where I parked it in a shopping center or on a street, and turn on the car remotely in the winter or in the summer to start the air conditioning or heat up the car. Well, that system in a 6-year-old car operated over 3G cellular, third generation cellular. And the major carriers ended 3G about 6 months ago. And there's no easy way to upgrade the equipment in my car. So I lost the ability to remotely open and close the doors and start the car and turn on the heat and the air conditioning system when the 3G network was disabled, to create bandwidth for the carriers to use for 5G networks. So in the past, it's been, I don't know, about 10 years between generations of cellular networks. As David implied, it's narrowing. They're rolling out new generations faster. And if you want to stay with technology, you got to upgrade your system. And that's another revenue generating opportunity for properties to upgrade from 4G to 5G and charge the carriers for the additional infrastructure being added to a cell site. I want to also just go back and pick up on a comment David had made at the beginning about cell site relocations. I regularly get calls from property owners saying, I've got a cell site in my building and I have the option to sell the building as part of a development site, and all the office leases and retail leases or residential lease have expired, or I've waited for them to expire, or I haven't given them renewal options. But this cell site has 4 more 5-year renewal options. How do I get rid of them? The answer is, if you didn't put a demolition clause in the lease, which was very hard and remains very hard to get in cell sites, it's a big pain in the butt, but it can be done. On the other hand, the carriers ask for a premium when they don't have an obligation to leave the building. However, you can, by doing a legal and engineering analysis, sometimes convince the carriers that they have an outdated site and it's of no use to them, and they shouldn't try and get $500,000 or $1 million to relocate. You'll let them out of the lease early so they can consolidate with a site they have across the street and have better cellular service and less rental expense for them. In return, you get the benefit of getting them out and being able to develop the site. But generally, you're going to have to pay them something, hopefully less than the high number they asked for initially.
And I'm going to expand that a little bit, Jeff, and say it's imperative, if you're looking for a redevelopment property that does have infrastructure, you can hire a consultant to audit the equipment that's not interfering with the actual tenant. Because in that case, we were talking about this the other day, where the carrier wanted something in the neighborhood of $500,000 or more to be bought out of a lease that was obsolete. The equipment was obsolete, everything about it. And you settled for a fraction of that, I believe.
Right. So I had a client that had a building that they were going to sell as a development site, and they had a cell site with those multiple renewal options. There's a telecom engineer that I work with a lot, and my client engaged him at my recommendation. He went and did a site visit to the building, inspected the wiring coming in from the street, the equipment room that the carrier had. I don't remember if it was in the basement or a container on the roof or in equipment, mechanical space, and looked at all the antennas on the roof. And he came back and he said to us, they have 12 antennas up there. They're not connected. They're all 20 years old. They're not in use. They have one small dish antenna the size of a pizza box that's connected. This same carrier has another cell site diagonally across the street that obviously replaced this site. That's the active site. And we went back to the carrier and we said, you're paying rent on this location. You're paying for fiber to come to the location. All you've got is that one pizza box sized antenna instead of the, I think it was $500,000 or $750,000 that they asked for us initially to terminate. We said to them, you can save all this operating expense by moving. You no longer have to pay us rent. You no longer have to pay for the fiber coming into the building. You no longer have to maintain it. And you can move to consolidate with the building across the street. And we ended up paying them, I think, $75,000 to cover that relocation and their legal fees and a little money in their pocket instead of $600,000 or $800,000 they had originally asked us for.
I also have a question.
Go ahead, Amber.
Sorry, I had a question just come in. What if the lease requires the tenant to direct connect for all utilities? Can you elaborate on this again? What is to pass to the tenant for an expense, as this is an income producing tower for the landlord?
So if you have a cell site lease, be it a tower or a rooftop lease, often the templates from the carriers allow them to obtain their electricity directly from the utility. So they're not paying submetering fees or a markup to the landlord. Typically, those agreements will also allow them to bring their own fiber into the site. You may have fiber already there that they could use, but they want the option to bring their own fiber in. Typically, those things are not a revenue generating ability for the property owner. Can't make money on the electricity you provide to the carrier. Sometimes if it's a cell site on the roof of the building and the building doesn't have direct metering by the utility, they'll pay electricity at a sub-metered rate with some minimal, maybe a 5% markup to the landlord, but they generally try and avoid any markup and they want to pay the actual costs for electricity, water if they use it for an air conditioning. As far as fiber, they typically want the right to bring their own fiber provider, often two, a primary and a redundant, into the building and up to the site without any charge from the landlord. It's baked into, that's another cost of the income stream you're getting under that cell site or tower lease.
And we have a few more minutes if anybody else wants to add a question to the Q&A box. And we will also be sending out the slides to everybody that registered, as well as the recording. The recording should be available tomorrow for everybody.
And in parting for me, it's just, if you have questions, pick up the phone and call us, send us an email. We're more than happy to field all kinds of questions, queries, because this is an arena that affects real estate in a significant way. And you need to have sometimes another set of eyes on it, because you don't have as many people that are available, like a real estate broker or some other professional that really understands this particular business. And that's why we're here. We want you guys to be successful, and we want you to take advantage of this really great, cellular market.
I agree with what David said, and glad to always help anyone if you have questions.
We just got a question in. What about the Sprint decom and pay and walk agreements?
So T-Mobile acquired Sprint a couple of years ago. They have been slowly but surely decommissioning many, not all, but many of the old Sprint sites. Most cellular antenna agreements, particularly for rooftop sites, sometimes for towers. If you read the agreement carefully, most of them give unless you had a lot of leverage and it was well negotiated or it was a portfolio agreement, most cases it contains very broad termination rights on the part of the carrier. Basically, when I walk a client through these agreements, I often say to them, this is an option on the carrier's part. They may be signing a deal that has a 5-year or a 10-year initial term and multiple 5-year renewal options. But if they want out earlier on an individual cell site, often there is a termination right buried in the agreement that allows them to terminate on short notice, sometimes paying 6 months, maybe a year's rent to terminate. Many of the old agreements, most of them for all the carriers, contain those unless they're portfolio agreements or were very heavily negotiated. And they can basically walk away on some notice or with some payment of a termination penalty. It's those rights that T-Mobile has exercised with many of the Sprint sites. Occasionally they kept the Sprint site and terminated a nearby T-Mobile site. Whichever was a better site and had better economics for them is what they're going to keep. One other question that I get regularly is, how do I get a cellular carrier onto my site if I want to add revenue? Not an easy thing to do. Folks like David and Amber can help you do that. But in many cases, it's a pure engineering decision made by the carrier that they look at their networks regularly and see where there are gaps and where calls are getting dropped and there is insufficient coverage. And they put out what's called a search ring and have what's called a site selection company look at buildings in those neighborhoods to find a location where they actually have the gap in coverage. At that point, you're well advised to get folks like David and Amber involved to help you negotiate the best deal you can and make sure you're protected.
Thank you.
All right, I don't think there's any other questions. All right, we want to thank everybody for your time today. And if you have any questions, our contact information is below or on your screen. And like I said before, we will be sending out the slides along with a recording. So thank you, everybody.
Appreciate your time.
Thanks, David and Amber, for organizing this and inviting me to participate.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thanks everyone.
All right, thanks, Nick.
Bye.
Thanks, Nick.